All right, so we've got this stack of psychology lectures you sent my way. Seems like the whole, the psychologist with the beard analyzing someone on a couch is only part of the story.
It really is interesting how that image kind of sticks around, huh?
Yeah. So how do we even, start unpacking all this? I
Hmm.
mean, we've got lectures on the history of psychology, research methods, even how we think about mental health has changed. That's a lot.
Maybe a good place to start is, with that stereotype of the psychologist on the couch. It's true that clinical psychology is a big part of the field.
That,
That's counseling, school psychology, things like that.
yeah.
Makes up about 2/3, actually. But it's not the whole story, not even close.
Okay, so what else is out there? Is it all lab coats and rats running through mazes?
Yeah, not quite. There's this whole other side called experimental psychology,
Yeah.
and it's all about trying to figure out, the normal stuff that we all do, learning and memory, how we perceive things, motivation.
Interesting.
And they mostly use human subjects, not just rats.
So it's less about fixing people and more about figuring out how our minds work in general.
That's a good way to put it. And that's where you get the difference between psychologists and psychiatrists.
Right, right.
Psychologists who usually have PhDs or PsyDs, they're all about the research. Psychiatrists, though, they're MDs.
Oh, okay.
So they can actually prescribe medication.
So if, you're struggling with depression and you think medication might be helpful, you'd see a psychiatrist.
Hmm.
But for talk therapy, or if you wanted to get involved in research studies, you'd go to a psychologist.
Yeah, exactly. Though there is this new thing where some clinical psychologists are actually getting the ability to prescribe medication. It's still early days, depends on where you are, but definitely something to watch.
So the lines are blurring a little.
A little bit, yeah.
Okay, so we've busted some myths about, who psychologists are, but these lectures also showed how deeply psychology is tied to philosophy. It's almost like, what came first, the therapist or the philosopher?
Yeah, it's easy to forget that psychology, as an official science, is relatively new. But the questions it's trying to answer, those are old. Philosophers have been thinking about this stuff for centuries, way before psychology became all scientific.
And these lectures mention some pretty big names in philosophy, right? Like Descartes, John Locke. What were they saying about the mind?
Yeah, absolutely. Descartes, back in the 1600s, was really the one who drew that line between mind and body, this idea that our mind is separate from our physical brain.
Wow.
It's a debate that's still going on in some ways.
It makes you think, what is the mind if it's not just the brain?
Right. It's a question that still keeps people up at night.
For sure.
And then you have John Locke coming along with his tabula rasa.
The blank slate.
Exactly, the blank slate. He was arguing that basically we're born empty and all our knowledge comes from experience, from living in the world.
Like we're all just blank canvases and then life starts painting.
That's a great way to put it. And that idea was huge for early psychologists, especially the behaviorists.
Makes sense. If we're all blank slates, figuring out how we learn from experience becomes even more important.
Exactly. And you can't forget David Hume either, another big name, with his idea of associationism.
I feel like I vaguely remember that term from college.
He linked sensory experiences like seeing a red apple or smelling bread to our mental processes.
So it's like our experiences aren't just random,
Yeah,
right? They're connected, making us learn and make patterns.
right. Hume said that experiences actually form these patterns and associations in our minds, and that became super important for later theories, especially behaviorism.
That's so interesting how these big, philosophical ideas set the stage for a whole scientific field.
It's true. Philosophy asking the big questions, then psychology trying to answer them with science, makes you wonder what ideas from philosophy today will shape psychology in the future.
For sure. But for now, let's move on from philosophy to the birth of, modern psychology. These lectures pointed to 1879 with Wilhelm Wundt and his lab.
Right, that's the big one.
So before Wundt, was it all just philosophy? No actual experiments?
Well, there were people trying to be scientific about the mind, but Wundt really gets credit for making the very first experimental psychology lab. And his focus was on trying to measure mental processes, like reaction times, how long it takes you to respond to something.
So taking those big abstract ideas about the mind and actually trying to measure them with data.
Exactly. That's what made psychology a real science. Now, early on, they relied a lot on introspection.
Introspection, that's where you analyze your own thoughts.
Yeah, where you have these highly trained people just analyzing their own experiences. But as you can imagine, that had its issues.
Yeah, trying to be objective about your own thoughts, that's tough.
So that's why in the early 1900s, things shifted towards behaviorism.
Okay.
Behaviorism was all about forgetting the inner stuff, the thoughts, and just focusing on what we can see and measure, behavior.
Makes sense. If you can't directly see or measure a thought, then focusing on actions seems more scientific.
It was all about being objective, and this is where people like B.F. Skinner come in.
Right, right.
But even with all this focus on outward behavior, there's this one giant we can't ignore, Sigmund Freud.
Freud.
Yeah.
Everyone's heard of him, even if they've never taken a psychology class. What made his ideas so different?
Well, he didn't just dismiss the importance of thoughts.
Okay.
He dove straight into the unconscious mind. His theories were saying that, our behavior isn't just about what we're aware of. It's driven by these deeper forces that we don't even see, often stemming from stuff in our childhood.
It's not just what we do, but why we do it, and that answer might be hiding in our unconscious.
Exactly. And his approach, psychoanalysis, it was controversial, yeah, but it opened up this whole new way of thinking about mental health. It wasn't just about what you did on the outside anymore. It was about understanding this hidden world of the unconscious.
So you've got Wundt trying to make psychology a hard science, the behaviorists focusing on actions, and Freud digging into the unconscious. It's like, what would they have thought of each other?
I would have loved to be a fly on the wall for that conversation.
Seriously.
Yeah.
But the story doesn't end there. These lectures also mention Carl Rogers and humanistic psychology.
Yeah.
Wasn't that all about personal growth and self-actualization? Kind of a different vibe from Freud.
Totally different. Rogers shifted the focus. It wasn't about digging into your past or trying to control behavior. It was about a person's potential for growth and self-discovery.
So like empowering the person rather than the therapist acting as the expert.
Exactly. And that's so different from psychoanalysis where
Yeah.
the therapist is trying to interpret your unconscious. Then there's behavior therapy, which used those principles from behaviorism and applied them directly to treating problems.
So instead of trying to figure out like hidden childhood traumas, it's more about using conditioning to change behaviors.
Right. It's all about understanding how a behavior was learned in the first place and then finding ways to unlearn it or learn new ones. That's where things like exposure therapy for phobias come from.
So much was happening back then. It seems like psychology was going in a bunch of different directions.
It was a wild time. And then, in the 1960s, there's another big shift, the cognitive revolution.
I'm guessing that means thoughts came back into focus.
You got it. The cognitive revolution was about looking at mental processes again, but in a way more scientific way this time. It wasn't just what you did, but understanding why you did it, based on your thoughts, your beliefs.
So after behaviorism ruled for a while, it was finally time to acknowledge that thoughts really do matter.
Exactly. Now, this wasn't just going back to that subjective introspection from the early days. The cognitive revolution was about figuring out those mental processes through clever experiments.
Can you give an example?
Sure. They do things like reaction time studies to figure out how we make decisions. They change up what information people have to process and then measure how long it takes them to make a choice.
Oh, interesting.
And that gave them insight into those mental steps involved.
So they were measuring things we can't actually see.
Exactly. And the lectures even talked about evolutionary psychology, which started popping up in the 1990s and brought a whole new perspective to things.
Evolutionary psychology, it's all about how our minds were shaped by like millions of years of evolution, right? To help us survive.
That's the gist of it. And that brings us to a really key point that these lectures hit on over and over. Nature versus nurture.
The classic question. Is it our genes or our environment that makes us who we are? Any answers yet?
Well, evolutionary psychology doesn't pick a side.
Okay.
It recognizes both nature and nurture. We have these built-in predispositions from our genes, but how they play out depends on our environment.
So it's not versus, it's both. Like a team effort.
Exactly. They even had this great example, sun tanning. We humans have that adaptation to make melanin when we're in the sun to protect us from those UV rays, right? That's the nature part. But how much melanin we actually make, how dark our tan gets, depends on how much sun exposure we get. That's nurture.
Oh, that makes sense. Our genes give us the potential to tan, but what happens depends on what we do and where we live.
Right. And it's like that for so many other things. Take intelligence, for example. Our genes give us a starting point, but our experiences, how we were raised, our education, Those all play a huge role in how smart we become.
So you can't just blame your genes if you didn't ace that math test, right?
Exactly. It's about how those genes interacted with your study habits. And another important point from evolutionary psychology is that adaptations aren't set in stone.
Okay.
Just because we have a certain tendency, it doesn't mean we can't change. We have the power to change our behavior, even overcome those instincts, especially if we understand them and have the right support.
So we're not just puppets of our genes. That's good to know.
Exactly. It's about choice, about agency.
But what about those times we make bad choices, even when we know better? Like, why do I always want that extra slice of pizza, even though I know I'll regret it later?
Actually, evolutionary psychology has something to say about that too. And that's where mismatches come in.
Mismatches.
It's this idea that some things that helped our ancestors and their environments might not work so well for us today. Like that craving for fatty, sugary food you mentioned, back when food was scarce. That craving was a good thing, helped our ancestors survive. But now, with junk food everywhere, that same craving leads to overeating, weight gain, health problems. It's a mismatch between our ancient brains and our modern world.
So it's like our brains haven't caught up to modern life.
It's a good way to think about it. And this idea can help explain all kinds of things we do that don't seem to make sense, like procrastination, or why we get so stressed by stuff that wouldn't have bothered our ancestors at all. But let's shift gears again and get back to one of the most famous names in psychology, Sigmund Freud.
Okay, this is where things get really interesting. I feel like I've heard so much about Freud, but I'm ready to learn more than just the pop culture version.
Yeah, well, it's important to know his background because it really shaped his ideas. He started out as a neurologist, treating patients with what was then called hysteria.
Hysteria, that's like physical symptoms, but no obvious physical cause.
Exactly. And it's what we now call conversion disorder.
Interesting.
And through his work with these patients, Freud started developing his theories about the unconscious mind. He started to believe that a lot of our behavior isn't a conscious choice, but is driven by these forces we're not even aware of,
Wow.
often stemming from past experiences, especially in childhood.
That's like saying there's this whole other world operating under the surface.
That's what he was saying. And he developed this whole model of the mind to explain it, introducing the id, ego, and superego.
Oh yeah, the famous trio. I've heard of them, but to be honest, I'm a little fuzzy on what they actually represent.
Yeah.
Can you break it down for me?
Sure. The basic idea is that our personality is made up of these three interacting parts, kind of like a committee, and they're always kind of battling it out. The id is the most basic, primitive part. It just wants what it wants when it wants it. Pleasure principle, they call it.
So it's like the toddler in all of us.
Well, exactly. Then you have the ego, which is more grounded in reality. It's trying to balance what the id wants with what's actually possible.
Okay.
What makes sense in the real world.
So if the id is, I want cake now, the
Mhm.
ego is, hold on, maybe just one slice.
Exactly. It's the mediator trying to keep things in check. And finally, there's the superego. That's our conscience, our morals, the rules we've internalized from our parents, society, all that.
So the superego is like the voice in your head saying, you know you shouldn't have eaten that whole cake.
That's a good way to put it. And according to Freud, these three parts are constantly interacting, often clashing, and that dynamic is what shapes how we think, feel, and act.
It makes you wonder who's really in control.
Hmm.
If there are all these unconscious forces going on, how much free will do we actually have?
That's the million-dollar question. It's been debated for centuries, really.
For sure.
But here's a fun fact. Freud didn't actually come up with the idea of the unconscious. These lectures mention William James, a big American psychologist. He was writing about it even before Freud.
So Freud took this existing idea and really ran with it.
Exactly. He didn't just describe it. He built this whole elaborate model to try and explain how it works, how it shapes our lives. And that model, even though it's controversial,
Yeah.
it's really changed how we think about ourselves and the mind.
Like even revolutionary ideas often build on what came before. So where did Freud's theories lead next?
Well, to really get Freud, we need to talk about one of his big concepts, defense mechanisms.
Defense mechanisms. That sounds intriguing.
They're basically these unconscious strategies our ego uses to protect us from anxiety, especially when the id, ego, and superego are really clashing.
So it's like our mind is playing tricks on us to avoid feeling bad.
In a way, yeah. And there's all different types, like repression. That's the classic one, where we push those unacceptable thoughts or feelings down into the unconscious, pretend they don't exist.
Oh, I've totally done that.
We all have. It's like sweeping things under the rug so you don't have to deal with them.
Right.
And then there's denial, where we just refuse to accept reality.
Denial It's not just a river in Egypt.
Haha, exactly. And then there's projection, where we take our own feelings and put them onto someone else. Like, instead of admitting you're jealous, it becomes, no, they're the jealous one.
It's like passing the buck on your own bad feelings.
Exactly. And then there's rationalization. That's when we create explanations for our actions that sound logical, but aren't the real reason we did something.
Oh, yeah, I didn't get the job because they obviously wanted someone with more experience,
Yeah.
when really you just bombed the interview.
Exactly. We're masters at making ourselves feel better.
For sure.
And then there's displacement. That's when we redirect our feelings to a safer target, like yelling at your dog when you're actually mad at your boss. Poor dog.
Yeah. It's easier to take it out on someone who can't talk back.
Right.
So, defense mechanisms. They're interesting, but they also make you wonder how much of reality we're actually distorting without realizing it.
That's the thing about the unconscious. It's working behind the scenes all the time.
Makes me think of that question from the lecture. Why do most people think they're above average? Is that a defense mechanism?
It is. It's hard to face our own flaws, right? So we tend to puff ourselves up a bit to feel better. And a little self-deception can be a good thing, keeps us motivated. But it's important to try and see ourselves honestly, too.
A little humility never hurts. Okay, so we have defense mechanisms, which are definitely interesting, if a little unsettling. What else did Freud have to say about how the mind works?
Well, you can't talk Freud without talking about psychosexual development. Fair warning, this is where things get a little more controversial.
Here we go.
Freud believed that our personalities are shaped by how our libido, which he defined as our sexual and aggressive energy, is channeled to different parts of the body as we develop.
Okay, this is starting to sound like a therapy session.
Yeah.
So walk me through it. How does that libido shape us?
So he proposed that we go through these stages in childhood, and each one is focused on a different erogenous zone, a part of the body that's really sensitive to pleasure. And how we navigate each stage can have lasting effects.
Okay, so what are these stages?
Yeah.
And how do they supposedly work?
The first stage is the oral stage. It's all about the mouth. Sucking, biting, babies exploring the world through taste. Freud said that if you get stuck at this stage, which could be from being weaned too early or too late,
Okay.
it can lead to certain personality traits as an adult, like being dependent on others, aggressive, maybe even obsessed with oral things, like smoking or biting your nails.
Interesting. So someone who's always chewing on a pen or biting their nails could be working through issues from babyhood.
That's the idea, though. It's important to remember these are just theoretical interpretations.
Right.
Then comes the anal stage, which is all about control and elimination.
Potty training time. I can see how that could be a big deal.
Exactly. Freud believed that if you have a hard time with toilet training, it could affect you later on. Someone whose parents were really strict during potty training might grow up to be really orderly, rigid, maybe even obsessed with control.
So all the neat freaks out there can blame their parents?
Well, it's not quite that simple.
Okay.
But the point is, early experiences with control can really shape us.
Makes sense.
And then we get to the famous phallic stage. This is where the Oedipus and Electra complexes come in.
Okay, this is the one everyone jokes about, but I gotta admit, I don't really get it. Can you explain it without, making it a Greek tragedy?
Sure, it's basically about kids figuring out their relationships with their parents
Right.
and forming their own gender identity. Freud believed boys unconsciously develop these desires for their mothers
Wow.
and see their fathers as rivals. That's the Oedipus complex.
Electric complex is the flip side, right?
Okay.
Girls with their fathers.
You got it. Freud thought that working through these complexes by identifying with the same-sex parent is crucial for healthy development.
Wow, so all this drama playing out in the minds of little kids.
It is a lot, and it's important to note these complexes aren't about actual sexual desire.
Okay.
It's more about how kids understand love and relationships.
That makes more sense.
Yeah.
So things calm down after the phallic stage.
They do. You've got the latency stage where supposedly sexual urges are repressed and kids focus on social skills, learning, and making friends.
A little break before the craziness of puberty.
Exactly. And then finally, you reach the genital stage, starting in puberty, which is all about mature sexuality and adult relationships.
Okay, so Freud's saying our personalities are formed in childhood, driven by these unconscious forces and how we handle these psychosexual stages.
That's the basic idea. And even though people debate his ideas, and they've been reinterpreted a lot over the years, there's no denying Freud made us think about childhood and the unconscious in a whole new way. He made us realize who we are as adults is deeply shaped by those early experiences.
It's a lot to think about.
Yeah.
And it really makes you realize just how much is going on in our minds that we're not even aware of.
That's the power of the unconscious, right? But our exploration doesn't stop with Freud. I think it's time to dive into how mental illness itself has been viewed throughout history, how we define what's normal versus abnormal.
Right. Because hasn't that changed a lot over time? What one culture thinks is normal, another might see as like totally out there.
Absolutely.
So how do we untangle all that? How has our understanding of mental illness evolved?
I think the best way to start is by looking back at how we've tried to categorize mental illness. Even those early attempts at classification tell us a lot.
All right, let's go back in time then. What were those early attempts like?
Well, they often reflected, the beliefs of the time, and some of those ideas seem pretty strange to us now.
Give me an example.
All right, so picture ancient Greece.
Okay.
You've got Hippocrates, often called the father of medicine. He was one of the first to try and create a system for classifying mental illness.
Interesting. Did he have like a whole DSM of ancient disorders?
Well, not quite a DSM, but he did divide mental illness into three main categories: mania, melancholia, and phrenitis.
I feel like I've heard those terms before. What did they mean back then?
Well, mania was for states of, really high energy and agitation,
Okay.
kind of like what we might now call mania or hypomania in bipolar disorder. Melancholia, on the other hand, was about deep sadness and despair.
But that sounds a lot like what we call depression today.
It really does show how some basic human experiences have always been around, right?
Sure.
And then there was phrenitis, which was basically any kind of mental disturbance that came with a fever. And a lot of those cases were probably caused by physical things like infections affecting the brain.
So back then, they didn't really separate mental and physical illness. It was all connected.
Exactly. They saw the mind and body as totally intertwined, and any illness, whether physical or mental, was thought to be caused by this imbalance in the four humors.
Oh, yeah. The four humors. Remind me what those are again.
So you had blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile.
Mm-hmm.
And they thought these humors had to be balanced for good health.
So, like, too much black bile, you get melancholic.
Exactly. Too much yellow bile, you get choleric, easy to anger. It was a pretty simplistic model,
Right.
but it was a start, right?
I guess so. And this idea of the four humors stuck around for a while, right?
Mm.
What happened next in how we understood mental illness?
Well, the Middle Ages brought a big shift, influenced by the rise of Christianity in Europe. Mental illness started being viewed through a religious lens.
So instead of humors being out of whack, it was about spiritual causes.
Exactly. They started attributing mental problems to things like demonic possession, witchcraft, even sin.
That sounds pretty scary. It must have been a tough time to experience mental health issues.
It really was. There was a lot of fear, and treatment often involved religious rituals, exorcisms, even imprisonment or torture.
That's a stark reminder of how far we've come.
Absolutely. But it wasn't until the Renaissance that we see a renewed interest in science, which paved the way for more humane approaches.
So that's where figures like Descartes and Locke come in, right?
Exactly. The Renaissance was a huge turning point. It was a gradual shift away from those religious explanations and towards a more scientific approach.
But when did we start to see, like, the development of more formal classification systems like the ones we use today?
Well, the 19th and 20th centuries were really key for that, and it was partly driven by some very practical needs.
Like what?
Well, the military actually played a role.
Oh, interesting.
After World War I and World War II, you had all these soldiers coming home with psychological trauma.
Right.
The military needed a way to categorize and understand those experiences so they could treat them properly.
It makes sense trying to put order to the chaos.
Exactly. And that push for a standardized system led to the development of the first official diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorders,
The DSM.
the DSM, published by the American Psychiatric Association in 1952. So that's where it all began.
That's right. And it's been revised several times since then. The current version is the DSM-5.
Okay.
Came out in 2013.
So it's been evolving.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
New research, changing cultural attitudes, they've all led to updates in how we define and categorize these disorders.
So why is the DSM important? Why do we even need this standardized system?
Well, a few reasons. First, it gives mental health professionals a shared language.
Okay.
That way, everyone's on the same page when diagnosing and treating patients.
So if, say, I see a therapist in New York and then move to California and see a new one,
Right.
they can both understand my diagnosis because they're using the same system.
Exactly. It keeps things consistent. Second, The DSM is crucial for research.
Okay.
By having these clear definitions, researchers can actually study disorders properly, compare their results, develop new treatments.
So you have to know what you're studying to study it. Makes sense.
Exactly. And third, the DSM is used for all the administrative stuff like insurance billing, disability claims, all that. So those codes for each disorder helps streamline things.
Exactly. It makes it easier to get mental health services covered by insurance. But as useful as the DSM is, the lectures also point out some potential problems with it. One concern is the potential for self-fulfilling prophecies.
Oh, right.
Once someone's given a diagnosis, it can be hard to get rid of that label, even if they get better.
It's like they get put in this box.
Yeah.
And it becomes part of their identity, even if they've made progress or maybe their experience doesn't quite fit the label.
Exactly. It's really important to see the person, not just the diagnosis,
Yeah.
to remember people are complex, they're always changing.
Right.
The DSM is a tool, not a complete definition of a person.
It reminds me of how our views on certain things have changed so much. The lectures use the example of, like, homosexuality, which used to be considered a mental disorder.
Wow.
That's a pretty big shift.
It is. What was once seen as a pathology is now just understood as part of the normal range of human experience. It really shows how important it is to keep questioning our assumptions and be open to new ways of understanding things.
Okay, so we've talked about the whole, like, defining and classifying mental illness thing.
Yeah.
But I'm also curious about specific disorders.
Sure.
These lectures covered so many, from anxiety and mood disorders to schizophrenia. There's a lot to unpack.
There is. And each one is different with its own symptoms, causes, treatments. Maybe we could start with like anxiety and mood disorders.
Okay.
They're so common, affecting millions of people.
It seems like everyone struggles with anxiety or feeling down sometimes. But where's the line between normal ups and downs and an actual disorder?
That's the key question.
Right.
And it's not always an easy answer. The lectures talked about looking at the intensity, how long it lasts, and how much it affects you. If it's constant, overwhelming, and it's getting in the way of your daily life, that's when you might want to consider getting professional help.
So it's about how it's impacting your life, your work, relationships.
Yeah.
Not just having a bad day or feeling stressed about something specific.
Exactly. And the lectures went into the different types of anxiety disorders. Each one's a little different.
Like phobias.
Right.
Those intense fears of certain objects or situations. I remember learning about a woman who had a phobia of buttons. It seems strange, but I guess phobias can be about anything.
They really can target anything, and it's not just about feeling a little uncomfortable. Phobias are about significant fear and avoidance that really messes with your life. Someone with a button phobia might avoid certain clothes or going to certain places,
Right.
It can really limit them.
And then there's panic disorder, where people have those sudden intense episodes of fear, often with physical symptoms, like racing heart, dizziness. It sounds terrifying.
It can be, and what's really scary is those panic attacks often seem to come out of nowhere. There's
Wow.
no clear trigger,
Yeah.
which just makes people feel more anxious and out of control.
So it's not just about feeling anxious in a stressful situation.
No.
It's these like waves of fear that hit you even when everything seems fine.
Exactly. And not knowing when it's going to happen again can lead to this fear of having another panic attack,
Right.
which just creates this horrible cycle of anxiety.
It makes you wonder what's happening in the brain during a panic attack. Like, is it the fight or flight response going off for no reason?
That's a good question. And while researchers are still trying to figure out all the details,
Yeah.
it seems like the parts of the brain that handle fear are definitely involved. The amygdala, which processes fear and threats, gets way too active during a panic attack.
So like the brain misinterprets signals and thinks there's danger when there isn't any.
Yeah, that's one way to think about it. And those physical symptoms, the racing heart, the feeling like you can't breathe,
Right.
those are the body's natural responses to danger. It's just that in a panic attack, there's no real danger.
It really shows how connected our minds and bodies are. Like our thoughts and emotions can cause real physical changes.
It's a good reminder that the mind-body connection isn't just some abstract idea.
Right.
It's a real thing that affects our health.
Okay, so we have phobias, we have panic disorder. What other kinds of anxiety disorders are there?
Well, there's generalized anxiety disorder, or GAD. That's about constant worry.
Okay.
People with GAD worry about all kinds of things: health, money, relationships, work, It's like their minds are always running through what-if scenarios.
That sounds exhausting. Like they can never relax because they're
No.
always waiting for the next bad thing to happen.
It's a constant state of unease that can really make it hard to focus, sleep, enjoy life.
And then there's obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD,
Right.
the ones about unwanted thoughts and the need to do certain actions over and over to feel better.
Yes. OCD is so interesting because it shows how powerful thoughts can be.
Hmm.
People with OCD have these thoughts that they know aren't rational, but they can't seem to get rid of them.
Like the classic example of someone washing your hands constantly because they're afraid of germs,
Yeah.
even though they know logically they're probably fine.
Exactly. And those repetitive behaviors, the compulsions, they do offer some relief from the anxiety, but they also make the whole cycle worse. It's a tough trap to escape.
It makes you think about how much control our thoughts have over our actions.
Mm-hmm.
It's like our brains get stuck.
That's a great point. And it's one of the reasons cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, often works well for OCD. CBT helps people recognize and change those irrational thought patterns.
So you break those mental loops by changing how you think.
Exactly. It's about teaching your brain to react differently and resist those urges.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So we've covered some of the main anxiety disorders. What about mood disorders? The lecture spent a lot of time on depression, which seems like it's everywhere these days.
It really is one of the most common mental health problems worldwide. And it's important to remember it's not just about feeling a little sad. Clinical depression is serious. It can really affect your whole life.
Yeah, it's not just having a bad day. It's that deep sadness, the hopelessness,
Right.
losing interest in things you used to enjoy.
Right. And there are often other symptoms too. Feeling tired all the time, changes in sleep and appetite, problems concentrating, even thoughts of suicide.
It's like this darkness that takes over everything.
It can be very debilitating.
And there are different types of depression, right? Like unipolar, which I think is what most people think of when they hear depression. And then there's bipolar, with those extreme mood swings.
Yes. Unipolar depression, or major depressive disorder, is that persistent sadness, low energy, feeling hopeless, and it can last for weeks, months, even years if it's not treated.
So it's important to reach out for help if you're going through that.
Absolutely. There are effective treatments, therapy, medication, things that can really help.
And what about bipolar disorder? What makes it different?
Bipolar involves episodes of both depression and mania. Mania is that elevated mood, tons of energy and activity. It's like the opposite of depression, but it can be just as disruptive.
So instead of feeling down and withdrawn, someone in a manic episode might be super talkative,
Yeah.
energetic, impulsive,
Yeah.
even do risky things.
Exactly. They might feel like they can do anything, but that can lead to bad decisions, reckless spending,
Oh, wow.
even aggression.
It sounds like a real roller coaster of emotions.
It is. And those swings can be really hard for the person and their loved ones. It's unpredictable. You never know what to expect.
So how do you treat bipolar disorder? Is it similar to treating depression?
Well, treatment often includes both medication and therapy. Mood stabilizers, like lithium,
Okay.
are often used to help even out those mood swings, to prevent both the highs and the lows.
And therapy can help people learn how to cope with those intense emotions.
Exactly. It's about finding ways to manage those ups and downs,
Right.
to build a more stable life.
It really emphasizes how important it is to get rid of the stigma around mental illness,
It's so important.
so people feel okay about getting help.
Absolutely. We need to make it normal to talk about mental health, to see seeking help is a good thing.
Okay, so we've talked about anxiety disorders, mood disorders, both super common and often really hard to deal with. But these lectures went even further. They got into those disorders that blur the lines between mind and body, somatoform and dissociative disorders.
Yeah, those are fascinating.
Right.
They really show how our psychology and our physical experiences are connected, how what we think and feel can manifest in really physical ways.
So somatoform disorders,
Right.
those are the ones where physical symptoms are caused by psychological factors.
Exactly. And the lectures talked about several types. There's illness anxiety disorder, which used to be called hypochondriasis. That's where people are constantly worried about having a serious illness, even if doctors tell them they're fine.
So like every headache is a brain tumor.
Yeah.
Every stomach ache is cancer.
Exactly. People with illness anxiety disorder often misinterpret those normal body sensations and think it's something serious. They might spend a lot of time researching symptoms, going to the doctor, even getting unnecessary tests.
It sounds exhausting, and it probably just makes the anxiety worse.
It does.
What about somatization disorder? I remember that one, too.
Somatization disorder, which is now called somatic symptom disorder, is where people have a bunch of different physical complaints, all
Right.
kinds of symptoms, pain, fatigue, digestive problems, even neurological stuff. But doctors can't find any physical cause.
So the pain is real, but it's coming from their mental state.
Right. And it's important to remember, these people aren't faking it. They're really suffering. It's just that the root of the problem seems to be psychological, not physical.
That must be so frustrating for everyone involved
Yeah,
trying to
but
figure out what's going on.
it really highlights the need for healthcare that takes the whole person into account,
Yeah.
mind and body.
Okay, so we have illness anxiety disorder and somatic symptom disorder. What other kinds of somatoform disorders did the lectures talk about?
Well, there's pain disorder, where the main symptom is, well, pain.
Makes sense.
But again, there's no obvious physical reason. The pain is real. It can be debilitating.
Yeah.
But it seems to be triggered by psychological things. Stress, trauma, maybe emotional conflicts.
So it's like the mind is making the pain worse.
That's a good way to think about it. It's this complicated mix of physical and psychological stuff.
Right.
And then there's conversion disorder, which is really fascinating.
I remember reading about that one.
Yeah.
That's where people lose some sensory or motor function, like they can't see or move a limb, but it's triggered by stress.
Exactly. It's like the mind is converting that distress into physical symptoms.
Wow.
And what's really interesting is that these symptoms often don't follow what we know about how the body actually works. Like someone with conversion blindness might still be able to walk around a room without bumping into stuff, even though they say they can't see.
That's incredible. It really shows how powerful the mind can be.
It makes you wonder how much of what we experience is really shaped by our thoughts and beliefs. It's a question for the ages.
For sure. So what else?
And then there's body dysmorphic disorder.
Oh, yeah.
That one's becoming more and more common, with our society being so focused on looks.
Body dysmorphic disorder. That's where people are obsessed with a flaw in their appearance.
Yes, but it's not just about feeling a little self-conscious. People with body dysmorphic disorder actually see their bodies in a distorted way. They might think they're ugly or deformed,
Right.
even when they look totally normal to everyone else.
So it's not just about vanity.
No, it's this deep-seated belief that there's something wrong with their looks, and it can take over their lives. They might spend hours grooming, checking mirrors, asking for reassurance, even avoiding going out or getting cosmetic surgery.
It's like their whole world revolves around this one perceived flaw.
It can be very distressing, and it really highlights the importance of addressing body image issues and promoting self-acceptance.
Absolutely. Okay, so those are the somatoform disorders, where the body becomes a way of expressing mental distress. What are dissociative disorders? The lectures said those involve like a disruption in how we experience ourselves, even our connection to reality.
Yeah, those are fascinating too.
Right?
They involve this splitting of consciousness,
Okay.
memory, identity, perception, like parts of the self become separated.
So it's not just feeling spacey or forgetting things.
Yeah.
It's a much bigger disruption.
Exactly. And there are different types. Dissociative amnesia, for instance, that's when someone can't remember important personal information, usually related to a trauma or stressful event.
So it's not just forgetting where you put your keys. It's blocking out whole chunks of your life.
Right. It's like the mind is protecting itself by shutting out those painful memories.
Yeah.
And it's important to note this isn't the same as amnesia caused by a brain injury.
Right.
This is psychological.
So the brain's fine, but the memories are blocked off for emotional reasons.
Exactly. It shows how powerful the mind can be. And then there's dissociative fugue, which is even more extreme. It involves someone suddenly traveling away from home and having amnesia for who they are.
So they could just disappear,
Yeah.
end up in a new city with no memory of how they got there.
It does sound like something out of a movie, but it does happen. They're often found just wandering around, totally confused about who they are, their past. It's like their sense of self just vanished,
That's incredible.
often triggered by extreme stress or trauma. And then, of course, there's dissociative identity disorder, or D, which used to be called multiple personality disorder. This is the one that gets a lot of attention, sometimes in not so accurate ways.
Yeah, the idea of having multiple personalities, it's almost hard to believe it's real.
It is complex, and it's definitely been misrepresented in movies and TV. People with D have 2 or more distinct identities, or alters.
Right.
And each one has its own memories, behaviors, even physical
So
characteristics.
it's like different cells sharing one body.
It's a way of coping with overwhelming trauma. The mind is trying to protect itself by separating different parts, so
Wow.
those painful memories don't have to be faced all at once.
It's heartbreaking,
It is.
but also shows how resilient we can be.
Absolutely. It's a testament to how the mind tries to survive, even if it means fracturing the sense of self.
Okay, so we've covered anxiety disorders, mood disorders, somatoform disorders, and dissociative disorders.
Yeah.
Mental illness is a vast and complicated topic.
It really is.
And we haven't even talked about psychotic disorders like schizophrenia.
That's a whole other area.
Right, schizophrenia, a term that gets thrown around a lot, often incorrectly,
Mm-hmm.
but the lectures really tried to explain it.
I think it's helpful to start with the term psychosis.
Okay.
It basically means a break from reality,
Okay.
a loss of contact with what most people consider to be real.
So it's not just having unusual beliefs.
Yeah.
It's about losing that shared sense of reality, not being able to tell what's real and what isn't.
Exactly. And schizophrenia is one of the most well-known psychotic disorders.
Right.
It has a whole range of symptoms that can affect thoughts, perceptions, emotions, and behavior.
The lecturers talked about positive and negative symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain what those are?
Sure. Positive symptoms are those that are added to someone's normal experience, like hallucinations and delusions.
Hallucinations, those are sensory experiences that aren't real, like hearing voices or seeing things.
Right. And delusions are those fixed, false beliefs
Okay.
that the person holds on to, even if there's evidence proving them wrong. Someone with a delusion of grandeur might think they have superpowers, or some famous person from history.
So it's like their reality is completely different.
It can be.
Yeah.
And these positive symptoms can be very distressing, make it hard to function.
And what about negative symptoms?
Negative symptoms are those that are taken away from someone's usual experience.
Yep.
Things like flat affect, alogia, and avolition.
Flat affect is like not showing emotion.
Yeah, someone with flat affect might seem unemotional, unresponsive, even when they're feeling things inside.
Okay.
Alogy means reduced speech. Someone with alogia might not talk much or give really short, empty answers. It's like their thoughts and words have been drained away.
Wow.
And avolition is a lack of motivation,
Right.
a lack of doing things, even simple stuff like getting dressed or eating.
It sounds like negative symptoms can be just as disabling as the positive ones.
They can, and they often get overlooked because they're not as dramatic or obvious.
It shows that schizophrenia is really complex. It affects people in so many different ways.
It does. And it's not just one thing. There are different subtypes, each with its own set of symptoms.
The lectures talked about like paranoid, disorganized, catatonic, undifferentiated, and residual types.
Yes. Paranoid schizophrenia is the one with those strong delusions and hallucinations, often about being persecuted or being super powerful.
Okay.
Disorganized schizophrenia involves really disorganized speech and behavior and flat or inappropriate affect. It's like their thoughts and emotions are all scrambled up.
And catatonic schizophrenia is the one with the really severe movement problems.
Exactly. It can range from being totally immobile to like agitated, purposeless movements.
And undifferentiated is just a catch-all category.
Right. For people who don't fit neatly into the other categories. And residual schizophrenia refers to people who've had an episode of schizophrenia in the past, but aren't showing strong positive symptoms right now. They might still have some negative symptoms or cognitive problems.
It sounds like schizophrenia is a really tough disorder to diagnose and treat.
It is. We don't know exactly what causes it, but research suggests it's a combination of genetic predisposition, problems in brain structure and function, and environmental factors.
So it's not just one thing.
No.
It's nature and nurture working together again.
Right. We know there's a strong genetic component, but things like infections during pregnancy or extreme stress in adolescence can also play a role.
And the brain itself seems to be involved.
Yep.
With studies showing differences in people with schizophrenia.
Yes, and there's more and more evidence suggesting that imbalances in brain chemicals, neurotransmitters like dopamine and glutamate, contribute to the symptoms.
So a lot of factors involved.
Yeah.
But these lectures at least gave a good overview of what we know.
They did. And even though schizophrenia is serious, often a lifelong condition, it's important to remember that with the right treatment and support, people with schizophrenia can have good lives.
Absolutely. Okay, so schizophrenia is a whole complex topic on its own. But the lectures also got into a whole category of disorders that are usually diagnosed during childhood or adolescence.
Right, and it's a really broad category. It
Yeah.
includes everything from learning disabilities to behavioral problems to developmental disorders and emotional disturbances.
The lectures picked out a few key examples. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, is one that's become much more widely recognized lately.
It has. ADHD is characterized by inattention, impulsivity, and hyperactivity. It can make it hard for kids to focus, control their impulses, sit still.
So it's not just about kids being, like, rambunctious.
No.
It's a real pattern that gets in the way of their lives.
Exactly. And ADHD isn't just a childhood thing. It can continue into adulthood, and now more and more adults are being diagnosed later in life.
Makes you wonder how many adults were struggling with this all along,
Mm-hmm.
that it just wasn't recognized.
That's very possible. It shows how important it is to keep learning about mental health
Right.
so people can get the right help, no matter how old they are.
The lectures also talked about autism spectrum disorder, which is another one that's become much more understood in recent years.
Yes. Autism is a neurodevelopmental disorder. It affects communication, social interaction, behavior,
Right.
and it's a spectrum, meaning it can look very different in different people.
So no two people with autism are the same.
Exactly. Some might not speak, while others are very articulate. Some might be amazing at certain things, like math or music,
Right.
but struggle in other areas.
And they often have trouble with social interaction.
Yes. People with autism might have a hard time understanding social cues, making eye contact, having back and forth conversations. They might also have very specific interests and do repetitive things.
The lectures mentioned autistic people often lack theory of mind. What does that mean?
Theory of mind is the ability to understand that other people have their own thoughts and feelings different from your own.
Right.
It's what helps us predict and understand other people's behavior.
So if someone doesn't have theory of mind, they might not get why someone's angry or why someone might lie to avoid hurting someone's feelings.
Exactly. It can make social situations really difficult because they might miss those subtle cues.
It shows how important that ability is for navigating the social world.
It is. And while there's no cure for autism, there are therapies like applied behavior analysis, especially if you start early, that can help people develop social and communication skills.
Another childhood disorder the lectures talked about is Tourette's syndrome, which involves those involuntary tics.
Right, those sudden repetitive movements or sounds.
Right, like blinking or throat clearing, even shouting out words.
Exactly. And they can range from mild to really disruptive.
Some people might just have a few little tics,
Mm-hmm.
but others might have really frequent, intense tics that get in the way of their lives.
That's right. And we still don't know exactly what causes Tourette's.
Okay,
Research suggests it's a combination of genes and environment,
right.
but we need more research to really understand it.
Are there treatments to help manage those symptoms?
Yes. Medication and behavioral therapies can help lessen those tics, make life easier for people with Tourette's.
Okay, so we've covered some of the disorders that are usually diagnosed in childhood. ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, Tourette's syndrome. It's a good reminder that mental health issues can show up at any age.
They really can. And recognizing them early is so important so we can provide support and make a difference.
Absolutely. The lectures also briefly talked about mental retardation, which is now called intellectual disability.
Yes, the terminology has evolved.
Right, it's important to use respectful language.
Absolutely.
So intellectual disability, it's about limitations in intellectual functioning and adaptive behavior.
That's right.
Intellectual functioning being like cognitive abilities, learning, problem solving, reasoning.
Exactly. And adaptive behavior means those everyday skills like
Mm.
communication, self-care, how well you get along with others.
So it's not just about IQ scores.
Oh,
It's about how you function in the real world.
exactly. And there are lots of different causes, from genetic conditions like Down syndrome to things like exposure to toxins before birth.
And the severity can vary a lot, right?
It does. Some people need a lot of support throughout their lives. Others can live more independently.
It's important to remember that people with intellectual disabilities are individuals with their own strengths and challenges.
Absolutely. And with the right support, they can live fulfilling lives.
The lectures then moved on to personality disorders, which are those patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving that are really different from what's considered normal and cause a lot of problems in someone's life.
Yeah, it's not just about having a quirky personality. These are inflexible, unhealthy patterns that can really get in the way of relationships, work, overall well-being.
So not just being a little shy or eccentric?
No, it's more than that. These patterns create real problems in multiple areas of life.
Okay.
And the DSM-5 lists 10 specific personality disorders grouped into 3 clusters based on similarities.
Right. I remember the lectures talking about cluster A,
Hmm.
which includes paranoid, schizoid, and schizotypal personality disorders. Those are the ones that are often seen as odd or eccentric.
That's right. Paranoid personality disorder is about a deep distrust of others,
Okay.
always thinking people are trying to harm them or deceive them, even when there's no reason to think that.
So they're always on edge.
Yeah, always suspicious. And schizoid personality disorder is about being detached from social relationships, not showing a lot of emotion. They might seem cold or indifferent to
So
others.
not just introverted, but like not interested in connecting with people at all.
Exactly. And then there's schizotypal personality disorder, which involves having eccentric thoughts and behaviors, sometimes almost psychotic. They might have strange beliefs, think they can read minds, or have trouble separating fantasy from reality.
So they might believe in the supernatural or have weird rituals.
They might, and their behavior can be off-putting to others,
Right.
which makes it hard to make friends or have relationships.
Okay, so that's cluster A. What about cluster B?
Cluster B includes antisocial, borderline, histrionic, and narcissistic personality disorders.
Oh, okay.
These are the ones that involve dramatic, emotional, or erratic behavior.
Antisocial personality disorder, that's the one that's linked to criminal behavior.
It is. It's about not caring about other people's rights, a lack of empathy,
Right.
being deceitful, manipulative, and reckless.
So it's not just about breaking rules.
Right.
It's about not having a conscience.
Right. And it's different from psychopathy, which is similar, but even more extreme,
Okay.
with a more severe pattern of antisocial traits, and often a total lack of remorse or guilt.
Borderline personality disorder. I feel like I've heard about that one a lot. What's it all about?
Borderline personality disorder is all about instability in relationships, identity, emotions.
Okay.
People with BPD might be terrified of being abandoned, act impulsively, and do things that hurt themselves,
Wow.
and have a really hard time managing their emotions.
So their relationships are probably pretty intense.
They can be. Lots of drama and conflict, and their sense of self might be really fluid, changing depending on who they're with.
It sounds really tough to live with that kind of emotional roller coaster.
It can be, and it often leads to self-harm, thoughts of suicide,
Right.
and problems keeping relationships healthy.
What about histrionic personality disorder? What are the signs of that one?
Histrionic personality disorder is all about being overly emotional and needing attention.
Okay.
People with HPD might be really dramatic, flamboyant, easily swayed by others.
So like the life of the party, always needing to be center stage.
Exactly. And they might use their looks or their emotions to try and manipulate people to get what they want.
And lastly, there's narcissistic personality disorder. What are the hallmarks of that one?
Narcissistic personality disorder is about having a huge sense of self-importance,
Okay.
a need for constant admiration, and not having much empathy for others.
So it's about having a big ego and always needing validation from others.
Right. They might think they're super special, deserve special treatment, and
Mm.
they might use people to get what they want without caring about anyone else's feelings.
It sounds like all these personality disorders can really make relationships difficult.
They can, and they often need specific kinds of therapy to address those patterns.
Okay, so we've covered cluster A and cluster B. What about cluster C? What falls under that category?
Cluster C includes avoidant, dependent, and obsessive-compulsive personality disorders.
Okay.
These are the ones with a lot of anxiety and fear.
Avoidant personality disorder, that's about extreme shyness, being afraid of social situations.
Exactly. People with avoidant personality disorder might avoid social contact altogether because they're so afraid of rejection or criticism.
So more than just being an introvert,
Yeah,
it's a deeper fear.
right. They might really want connections, but just be too scared to put themselves out there.
And dependent personality disorder is about needing to be taken care of, being afraid to be alone.
Yes. They might rely on others for everything: decisions, reassurance, support.
So they have trouble standing on their own 2 feet.
They might. They might not be able to make decisions on their own, feel lost without someone else.
An obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, which is different from OCD,
Right, different from OCD.
is about being obsessed with orderliness, perfection, and control.
Exactly. People with OCD might be very rigid, inflexible, can't relax. They might be super focused on rules, details, schedules,
Yeah.
and have trouble letting go and letting others help.
It seems like all these personality disorders can really make life difficult.
They can, but it's important to remember that they are treatable. Therapy can help people understand those patterns, learn better ways of coping,
Mm-hmm.
and improve their relationships and their lives overall.
Okay, so we've covered a ton of ground, from anxiety and mood disorders to schizophrenia, somatoform, dissociative, and personality disorders.
Mm.
Mental illness is such a broad and complex thing.
It really is, and it's something that affects everyone, either directly or indirectly.
Absolutely. But understanding those disorders is just part of it.
Right.
We also need to talk about how we try to treat the mind,
Mm.
how we try to alleviate suffering.
Absolutely. And these lectures really emphasized how those treatment approaches often come from what people believe causes mental illness in the first place.
So if you think a disorder is mainly biological, you might focus on physical therapies, like medication.
Mm-hmm.
If it's rooted in psychological stuff, talk therapy might be the answer.
Yeah.
If it's about learned behaviors, you might go with behavioral therapies.
That's a great summary.
Right.
Different ideas about the roots of mental illness have led to all these different ways of treating it.
And the lectures talked about those three broad categories of therapy: physical, talking, and behavioral.
Exactly.
And each one has a whole bunch of different treatments and techniques.
It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. What works for one person might not work for another.
Right.
And it often takes a combination of approaches.
So it's about finding the right tools for the job. And those tools can be anything from medication to talking to a therapist to even making changes in your lifestyle.
Exactly. It's about creating a treatment plan that fits the individual.
Okay, let's start with physical therapies. I think most people think of medication when they hear that. These lectures talked about psychopharmacology, which sounds kind of intimidating.
It does sound a bit complicated, but it just means using medication to treat mental illness.
Okay.
And these medications, they work by targeting those neurotransmitter systems in the brain.
Right, those chemical messengers that allow brain cells to talk to each other.
Exactly. And different neurotransmitters have different jobs. Serotonin's involved in mood, dopamine's about reward and motivation, GABA has calming effects.
So psychotropic meds basically try to adjust those neurotransmitter systems, either boosting or lowering the levels of certain chemicals.
That's the idea. And that's where all those different types of psychotropic meds come in. Antipsychotics, antidepressants, mood stabilizers, and anxiolytics.
The lectures mentioned antipsychotics are mainly used for psychotic disorders like schizophrenia.
That's right. Antipsychotics, sometimes called neuroleptics, block dopamine receptors in the brain. This can really help reduce the positive symptoms of schizophrenia, like hallucinations and delusions.
So it's like calming down those overactive dopamine pathways.
That's a good way to think about it. Now, antipsychotics can be really effective, but they can also have side effects.
Right.
So it's really important to monitor them carefully.
And antidepressants, those are for depression.
Yeah. Antidepressants work in different ways, but many of them focus on serotonin and norepinephrine. SSRIs, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, are a common type. They work by increasing serotonin in the brain.
So they're giving the brain a boost of serotonin.
Exactly. Which can help improve mood, energy, all that.
Yeah.
There are other types of antidepressants too, like SNRIs and tricyclic antidepressants that target different neurotransmitters.
The lectures also talked about mood stabilizers, which are primarily used for bipolar disorder.
Yes. Mood stabilizers like lithium help to even out those mood swings, prevent those extreme highs and lows.
It's like they keep things more balanced.
Exactly, like an anchor that keeps the ship from going too far in either direction.
I like that analogy.
Right.
And then there are anxiolytics, which are for anxiety disorders.
Right. Anxiolytics, also called anti-anxiety meds, often work on GABA receptors in the brain. Remember GABA, the calming neurotransmitter?
Yeah. So these medications boost the effects of GABA, reducing anxiety and helping people relax.
Exactly. Benzodiazepines, like Xanax and Valium, are a common type. They work fast, but can be habit-forming.
Right.
So they're usually just for short-term use.
Okay, so there are a lot of different medications that can target those brain chemicals and help manage symptoms. It's amazing how much progress has been made.
It is. But it's super important to remember that medication is just one part of the picture.
It's not a magic cure-all, right?
Right. Medication can be really helpful, but it's often most effective when it's combined with therapy, which focuses on the thoughts and behaviors that contribute to the problem.
Okay, so let's talk about talking therapies. Those are the approaches that focus on exploring your thoughts and feelings and behaviors, not just brain chemistry.
Exactly. Talking therapies come in many different flavors, each with its own theory and techniques.
The lectures talked about psychoanalysis, which is Freud's thing, right?
That's right. Psychoanalysis dives deep into the unconscious, exploring how those past experiences, especially from childhood, shape us.
So it's about bringing those hidden conflicts to the surface.
like excavating ancient ruins. Psychoanalysis uses things like free association, where the patient just says whatever pops into their head,
Right.
and dream analysis, where you try to figure out what those dream symbols mean.
That sounds pretty intense, and it can take years.
It can. Traditional psychoanalysis is definitely a long-term commitment. And while it's been really influential, some people criticize it for being too time-consuming and expensive.
And I imagine not everyone's comfortable digging up all that stuff from their past.
Right. And that's one reason other therapies have popped up,
Yeah.
like psychodynamic therapy, which is kind of like a streamlined version of psychoanalysis.
Psychodynamic therapy. That's one that focuses more on current relationships and patterns.
Exactly. It's less about digging up ancient history and more about how past experiences are affecting you now.
So you're still looking at unconscious patterns, but in a more focused way.
Right. Psychodynamic therapy doesn't usually take as long, and it focuses on the specific issues the person is dealing with.
The lectures also mentioned humanistic therapy, which seemed really different.
Yes. Humanistic therapy is all about empowering people to grow and reach their full potential. It was championed by Carl Rogers.
So it's less about fixing what's wrong and more about helping people become their best selves.
Exactly. Humanistic therapists try to create this really supportive, non-judgmental space
Okay.
where clients can explore their feelings and figure out what they truly want in life.
It's about helping them understand and accept themselves.
Right. And a key concept in humanistic therapy is this idea of unconditional positive regard. That means accepting the client completely for who they are no matter what.
That sounds amazing, to feel that level of acceptance.
It can be really powerful. It allows the client to be vulnerable and authentic without fear of judgment.
So we have psychoanalysis, psychodynamic, and humanistic therapies. What other types of talking therapies were in the lectures?
Well, there's cognitive therapy, which focuses on changing those negative thought patterns.
Oh yeah, that's where you challenge those irrational beliefs that are driving your actions.
Exactly. Cognitive therapy is based on the idea that our thoughts shape how we feel and behave. So if we change those negative thoughts, we can change everything else.
So it's like rewiring your brain to think more realistically and positively.
You got it. Cognitive therapists help people recognize those distorted thinking patterns, like catastrophizing, always thinking the worst will happen,
Right.
or all or nothing thinking, and then find more balanced, helpful ways of thinking.
And that can be really helpful for anxiety and depression.
Right. It can.
Right.
And it often involves doing homework where clients practice those new thinking skills in their daily lives.
So it's not just talking in the therapist's office. It's about actually making changes.
Exactly. It's taking what you learn and putting it into action.
Makes sense. And then there's behavioral therapy, which is about modifying learned behaviors.
Yes. It's all about figuring out how those behaviors were learned and then finding strategies to change them.
The lectures mentioned classical and operant conditioning. Can you refresh my memory on those?
Sure. Classical conditioning is about pairing a stimulus with a response. Like Pavlov's dogs, remember? Ringing a bell and the dogs start drooling because they expect food.
Oh, right. And how is that used in therapy?
Well, for phobias, for example, you can gradually expose the person to the thing they're afraid of while teaching them relaxation techniques.
So you're creating a new association, replacing the fear with a feeling of calm.
Exactly. That's called exposure therapy. The idea is that repeated exposure can actually get rid of the fear response.
And what about operant conditioning?
Operant conditioning is about rewards and consequences. Think about giving a dog a treat when they do a trick. In therapy, this might involve using token economies, where people earn points for good behaviors that they can then trade in for rewards or privileges.
So you're trying to make those healthy behaviors more appealing.
That's the idea. And behavioral therapy can be really effective for all sorts of things, from addiction to anxiety to autism.
Wow, so many different types of talking therapy.
Right.
We've got psychoanalysis, psychodynamic, humanistic, cognitive, and behavioral. It's amazing how many different approaches there are.
It is. And new therapies are being developed all the time.
Which makes finding the right therapist even more important, right? Someone you click with, who uses techniques that work for you.
Absolutely. And there's group therapy, too, which can be really helpful. That's where people come together, share their experiences, and support each other.
Group therapy can be especially powerful for people who feel isolated, like they're the only ones going through something.
Exactly. It creates this sense of community, lets people learn from each other's stories.
Okay, so we've covered so much in this deep dive.
Yeah.
From how psychology started to all the complexities of the brain and behavior, different disorders, and all the different ways we try to treat them. What a journey.
It's been amazing. But remember, it's just a starting point. There's always more to learn about this incredible field. And we focus mainly on the Western perspective, haven't we?
That's true. There are so many other cultural perspectives and traditions out there that we didn't even touch on.
Right. Western psychology doesn't have all the answers.
Yeah.
It's important to keep an open mind about different ways of understanding the mind and how to heal.
So, to our listener, we encourage you to keep digging deeper. Pick something from this deep dive that sparked your interest and see where it takes you. Maybe it's defense mechanisms or a specific type of therapy or that nature-nurture debate. There's a whole world of knowledge out there.
And remember, understanding ourselves and each other is a lifelong process. Keep those questions coming, stay curious, and never stop learning.